This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
If you're a seeker, don't miss the inspiring book Shamanic Awakening, Between the Dark and the Daylight. This remarkable work chronicles shamanic counselor and indigenously trained dream decoder Sandra Cochran's 35 years of experience with diverse wisdom keepers throughout the Americas. Sandy's initiations across the British Isles, Turkey, Greece, and Egypt, combined with her knowledge of symbology, psychology, and myth, influence her dream blog and workshops. Sandy offers private readings, sacred international journeys, a meditative CD, and her book, Shamanic Awakening, to encourage you as you navigate your earth walk and create a deeper connection to yourself. Find this and more at her website, starwalkervisions.com.
This is A Different Perspective with Kevin Randle. A retired U.S. Lieutenant Colonel, Kevin Randle has been studying UFOs for nearly 50 years. Kevin has investigated some of the most famous UFO cases in the world and has been consulted for dozens of documentaries about UFOs. Considered one of the leading experts into the Roswell UFO crash of 1947, Kevin has written more than 25 books about UFOs, including the recently published Roswell in the 21st Century. Now, here is the host of A Different Perspective, Kevin Randle.
And good evening. Welcome to this edition of A Different Perspective with me, Kevin Randle, as you already know. I'm going to be joined in just a moment by Don Ledger, but before I get to him, I'd like to point out one thing. Back in the 1990s, more than 20 years ago, I was at a MUFON conference. I was there as one of the speakers, as was Chris Stiles. And Chris Stiles' program was about the ShagHarbour UFO crash. And I was busy preparing a book called Scientific Ufology, and some of the things that he had proposed or mentioned during his lecture were fascinating to me. And I asked Chris if I could use some of that material, with proper credit, of course, in the book. And Chris kindly granted permission, as long as I would mention his partner, Don Ledger, in it. Well, when the book came out, I actually had called him Doug Ledger. So after all these years, Doug, Don, whoever you are, I would like to apologize for that gaffe and welcome you to the program. I will tell people that you are a private pilot and an aircraft owner with 20 years experience and over 1,000 hours of flying time, a former zone commander for the Halifax District Civil Air Search and Rescue Association. He is also past president and current editor for the Stanley Sport Aviation Association. He is a member of the Canadian Owners and Pilots Association and the U.S. Experimental Aircraft Association. He's a coordinator at the Legislative Television. Ledger spends his free time flying and writing. I believe his most important book, at least for me, his most important book, and it was written with Chris Stiles, of course, is Dark Object, the world's only government-documented UFO crash, which details the ShagHarbour UFO crash. So, Don, welcome to the program.
Well, thanks very much. If you hadn't mentioned the Doug incident, I would have brought it up myself.
Well, it was just horrifying for me.
Oh, it was all right.
As you can imagine, and I mean, somebody puts in that much work on a project, a UFO investigation. At least I got the Ledger part right, okay?
Yeah, the Ledger part was good.
And then I've apologized in other areas of communication repeatedly for this gaffe, and I apologize in person for it now.
Yeah, no problem. it's not a big deal. That you quickly change that, and of course, since those days and the book came out, it became a little bit better or more well known as a writer about UFOs. I had the other book out too, Maritime UFO Files, and which is arose from the search for documents. I had to do it all over again once I decided to write the book, and I re-interviewed Chris, and then I went into the library loaner system in order to get back in those days. We're talking probably 96, 97. That was the way we did it then. I'd go through the library loaner system and get the microfilm from the National Archives in Ottawa and go through all of those myself to find the ShagHarbour documents. And of course, during that time, that's when I really got my eyes open because, Kevin, for years I'd read about UFOs like yourself, I had an interest in it. And I wanted to find out more and more about it, but just about all of the books I ever read were usually American-based. Not usually, pretty much basically that's what it was, American-based. And then when I went through the documents, there were 7,700 of them in Ottawa that came on those RG 76, 24, 21, I think. I can't remember the other one. And about 7,700 documents on there. Now, there was a bunch of garbage in there, but there was thousands of UFO reports, and most of them were either military reports or, Air Force, and or police reports, and then the odd report to the smaller agencies we had in Canada to match, APRO and NICAP and so on back in the early days. So amongst them, I found about 500 that pertained to my area down here in the eastern part of Canada. And I downloaded all of those. It cost me a few $100s in quarters to get them all. And because in those days, you photocopy it on the machine you were operating the microfilm on. And that's when I got those out. I wrote, and from that I wrote Maritime UFO Files. That was just sort of by accident. But anyway, yeah.
Well, let me interrupt you here, Don, because we're going to have to take a quick break.
Sure.
And when we come back, we'll discuss ShagHarbour and give people a little bit of an update on it. But we will be back right after these messages and with more with Don Ledger.
This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
How would you like to be able to read other people's minds? Well, the next best thing is here. When you know how to read a person's name, you know how the person thinks, feels, and behaves. Each letter in our name holds a key to unlock our true essence. Our name contains both our gifts and challenges in this lifetime. Mnemology science discovers personality secrets hidden in the placement of the letters of our names, including the first and last impression people remember about us. Sharon shows us how to interpret the arrangement of letters as outlined in her book, Know the Name, Know the Person. Sharon Lynn Wyeth created mnemology science after 18 years of research and testing her theories, and has supported thousands of people around the world in understanding themselves and others better. You'll enjoy Sharon's unique teachings as she shares her system to learn the gifts behind your given birth name. Even if you don't like your birth name, there are jewels in this book. If you're thinking of changing your name, ready to name your child, or wanting to get along better with others, this is the book for you. If you'd like to improve your relationships and change your life for the better, get the book today, Know the Name, Know the Person, or visit www.knowthename.com. That's www.knowthename.com.
Take a step back in time and discover old Florida cuisine at Marsh Landing Restaurant in Fellsmere, Florida. Enjoy delicacies such as frog legs, gator tail, catfish, and swamp cabbage, or enjoy the more traditional cuisine such as hand-cut Angus steaks, ribs, and seafood. Join us for breakfast with a southern flair featuring sweet potato pancakes, biscuits and gravy, and much more. Planning a party? Marsh Landing's private dining rooms can accommodate groups from 8 to 80 people. While you visit, enjoy the historic pictures, artifacts, and stories that line the walls. Marsh Landing is truly a unique experience. Marsh Landing Restaurant, 44 North Broadway in historic downtown Fellsmere, or visit marshlandingrestaurant.com. Marsh Landing, old Florida cuisine at its best.
And believe it or not, we are back with Don Ledger. And I was wanting to talk about Dark Object, the world's only government-documented UFO crash, which is a book that he wrote about the ShagHarbour case. We'll get into the maritime UFOs here in a little bit of time here. But I think, Don, can you give us just a brief background on what the ShagHarbour UFO crash is all about?
Sure. It's not easy to brief it up, but essentially October 4th, 1967, and cool, clear evening, no moon, and around 20, this is the beginning of this particular incident, about 25 after 11 in the evening, so quickly it went from October the 4th to the 5th. Two different cars were driving back from an area called Cape Sable Island, which is about, 5 or 6 miles as the crow flies, maybe 10 miles by road to the northeast of ShagHarbour. And it's they call it an island, but it's got a causeway going out to, and the Coast Guard harbor is out there too. But anyway, these people were coming back from some kind of a community event there, and one of them was Laurie Wickens. Laurie Wickens, and he had a buddy of his in the car with him, and as they're driving along, coming along, heading southwest to ShagHarbour back home, they saw these lights on the right-hand side of the car seem to be paralleling them up maybe 1,000 or 1,500 feet, traveling along with the car.
These were just lights, colored lights, any color to them? Anything?
Yeah, they were sort of an amber gold-colored light, 4 to 5 of them flashing in sequence from front to back or back to front, on the edge, but they really couldn't make out the object itself. So anyway, they watched this thing, and they were, by this time, he's picking up a little bit of speed, and it's on Old Highway number 3, which is pretty much the same, looks pretty much the same as it did back in 1967, even today. And but it's a curvy old thing, 2-lane highway, and so they followed this thing along, and it eventually made its way right into the edge of ShagHarbour, the village, and they traveled on through. They're going at a pretty good clip at this point, basically speeding. And right through ShagHarbour and out the other side to Maggie Garrett's Point, which is just on the southwestern side of ShagHarbour. It's maybe a half or quarter mile long. And they lost it behind some trees as it curved around in front of the car, losing altitude, coming down at about a 45-degree angle. And they thought then, okay, this is going to crash into the water, which would have been the sound between ShagHarbour and Otter Island or Bon Potage Island, whichever one you prefer. And so they came around to Bend, and the Irish Moss plant was sitting there. It's got a gravel parking lot. The plant's probably about 40 by 50 feet, and maybe 20 feet high, cinder block type building. And but anyway, they pull into the parking lot onto gravel. They go right, and by this time they're right at the edge of the water. And they get out of the car and they look out and they see this thing that seems to be either floating on the water or just above it. And
when you say thing, did it have the amber lights on it still? Was it?
It rather than the flashing lights at this point, it had a pale yellow light at what they assumed was the top, It looked to be about 60 feet wide, and with this pale yellow light, and about maybe 10 to 12 feet thick through from the bottom to the top at the center. It was oval shaped.
They're looking at an actual object now, not just lights in the sky, an actual object on the water.
Yeah, but there's no moon, so it's hard to see out in the water. The water is relatively calm. They didn't know, and it seemed to be moving out. Now, they thought maybe if it's sitting on the water, the tide was at ebb, and they thought maybe it was moving with the tide, or maybe it was under its own power. But what they thought it was an airplane that had just crashed and was drifting on the water. That's their first impression. Laurie Wickens get back in the car with his people. They run up further down the road to Lower Woods Harbor, which is only about a quarter mile away. There's a gas station there, and it had one of the old payphone boxes on the outside. So he went in and he called the RCMP detachment back in Barrington Passage, which is going back to the northeast again, about probably 15 miles, and got a hold of Victor Verbicki, who was Corporal Victor Verbicki, who was the duty officer that night at the RCMP detachment. And he was by himself. And Laurie said to him, he said, "I think we just saw a plane crash into just outside of ShagHarbour in the Sound." And Laurie's about 18 years old. Everybody involved here at that time was around 18 years old. And Verbicki says to Laurie, because he knows him, he said, "Have you been drinking?" And of course, Laurie, Dickie, they call him in the area. Dickie said, No, I've been drinking. He got kind of ticked off about that. And anyway, he said, "Well, just my other line's ringing." He was by himself in the detachment. He said, "My other line's ringing. So what I want you to do is give me the phone number there." And he took the phone number down to the pay booth. He says, "You stay right there, and I'll call you back." Picks up the phone, and there's somebody from Megagarren's Point, which is, the point they just passed to get to the Irish Moss plant, and said that they just thought they saw an airplane crash into the Sound. And then the phone rings again. Somebody from Bear Point had called in, they saw something going down towards the water over towards ShagHarbour, might have crashed into the harbor. They're further away. Another one from a woman.
So now we've got a number of witnesses talking about the thing falling into the harbor. It's not just a bunch of teenagers, which is the way the Condon Committee wrote it off, but it's several people in the area saw the object in the sky, saw it falling toward the water.
Exactly. And then another phone call came from Cape Sable Island, which I mentioned to you earlier, and it was a woman and her daughter who were returning back from the same community function, and they saw it coming down too, way over towards ShagHarbour, and they thought it might have crashed in ShagHarbour, an airplane. So everybody's thinking an airplane crashed in ShagHarbour, and that's what Verbicki's thinking now when he calls back to Laurie. He says, "Okay, I'm getting all kinds of phone calls. I want you to go back to the Irish Moss plant and keep an eye on the thing, okay?" And so that's what Laurie does. In the meantime, he gets a hold. I'm trying to exhilarate this thing for you, Kevin. He gets a hold of two Mounties he's got staked out on a clearing somewhere down past Lower Woods Harbor, looking for deer jackers. That's what they call them here in Nova Scotia. People who poach deer, if you want to call it that. It was hunting season, but doing it at night is illegal. Anyway, so these two guys go racing back to Barrington. They meet with Verbicki there. The two officers were Ron Pond and Ron O'Brien, the two Rons we call them. And all three of them head back to towards ShagHarbour to the Irish Moss plant. In the meantime, Dave Kendrick and boy, I'm missing one of my main people here. When they were in their car, they were heading back at the same time behind Laurie Wickens' car, and they saw the same thing in the sky.
So we've got multiple witnesses. We've got multiple witnesses to this thing. There's a lot of people saw it down. People saw it on the ocean or on the in the harbor. So let's advance it a little bit. We got military get involved at some point. Wasn't there a photograph taken, something like that, that also seems to document this? Not to mention all the documents that you will find later. But so isn't the military eventually brought into this?
Yeah, they were. Just before that, we've got about 24 people now at the Irish Moss plant that show up. There are people driving by, including the next premier of Nova Scotia about 3 years later. And they saw this thing all floating on the water and getting further out. They think if it's an airplane, they got to get boats out there. They get a couple of boats out there. They run into the area. They find the famous foam that's about 3.5 inches, 4 inches thick, that looks like shaving cream with a glittery yellow surface. All the fishermen,
this
No.
foam is associated with the object, with the thing that fell.
Yeah,
into the
they're
ocean.
thinking. Of course, the people there that are out on the boats now are thinking maybe this is a product of jet fuel or regular aircraft fuel. And as you and I know, it doesn't react that way with salt water. And but anyway, they sail into this foam, which is about a half mile long, about 80 feet wide. They try to take samples that won't come out of the water. There's more detail on that, and so on and so forth. Now, in the meantime, Ron O'Brien had been tasked by Victor Werbicki to contact the RCC, which is Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax, which is a quasi-military civilian thing, and see if there was any aircraft missing. They do the usual searches, if like if you didn't show up to your airport in time and you had a flight plan and so on. And they had done a thorough search and were not able to find anybody missing either here or even down in the eastern seaboard of the United States. And no military, no commercial aircraft, and no private aircraft. So they got back to the Coast Guard station over in Cape Sable Island, who was on its way over now, and they finally arrived there about 12:30 in the evening over at the crash site, supposed crash site. And they told Ron O'Brien, who was the on-scene commander at this time, that there was no aircraft missing, that as far as they knew. So everybody at that point is wondering, well, what the hell are we looking for here? What's going on? We all saw it. And so that's how the RCMP got involved. The RCMP request to RCC in Halifax went through to Ottawa to the air desk, which was actually manned by the RCAF in the day. And that's how the military side of it got involved. And so they started thinking, well, we better get some divers down there and see what happened. Maybe it was some aircraft that we didn't have listed. Maybe it was military and they didn't want to talk about it or something.
Well, let me break in here, because there was a photograph taken, wasn't there? Isn't there a photograph?
I know what you're talking about. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is a big, huge network here in Canada, sort of like your ABC, NBC, CBS, anything like that. They had been down there, and they during the day, the next day, and filmed the fishing boats operating out on the water. Everybody's taking this seriously, Kevin, because the Halifax Mail Star Chronicle Herald, Mail Star had covered this, and it was the biggest newspaper in Eastern Canada, and very conservative newspaper. And if you look up anywhere and look up for the newspaper headline, which was in red, usually you'll see it black and white online on the internet or on Google or whatever, says in 2-inch letters right across the top of the front page, maybe something concrete to UFO crash in ShagHarbour, RCMP, and RCAF, and which kind of shocked everybody. It was the article was written by Ray McLeod. He was a reporter for the Herald Mail, and so anyway, don't forget now we're already into the 5th. By the 6th, they had shuttled divers from the Fleet Diving Unit from the Navy in Halifax at Stadacona, and they went down there and they got into the water around 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday. They searched around till around 6:30, and then they finally said, well, we can't find nothing. They reported back to Ron Pond, the on-scene commander, and said, we can't find anything down there. There's nothing there as far as we know. And because everybody's calling this a crash and this thing sunk. But anyway, maybe it did, but apparently it was under its own volition. And so having discovered that, Ron O'Brien contacted RCC in Halifax. RCC in Halifax is going through Maritime Command, which is the Navy, and then back to the RCC headquarters, the Royal Canadian Navy in Ottawa, and they're telling them to go back out there, stay there until further notice, and keep looking.
Okay, let me break in here. So we've got lots of witnesses who saw the thing in the air, lots of witnesses who saw it on the water, and now we have the Mounties involved. We've got the Royal Canadian Navy involved. You talked about the Royal Canadian Air Force being involved in some fashion.
RCAF,
So they're all generating documents. So this thing is well documented.
Oh yeah.
So when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about this documentation. But let me remind you, we're talking a little bit here about Dark Object, the world's only government documented UFO crash. And you can learn more about Don Ledger at www.donledger.com/UAP.html. So we will be back talking more about this in just a few moments.
This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
While science pursues fact, magic accesses the quantum level, bridging random facts to form truth. As long as science and magic remain separate and polarized, the truth cannot be known. I'm Gwilda Wiyaka. Join me on the Science of Magic radio program, dedicated to unification and evolution of consciousness. During each episode, I'll be speaking with experienced and respected scientists and mystics. From astrologers to astronomers, from medical doctors to shaman, the scientific method to dowsing and intuition, we'll weave together information from seemingly divergent practices to promote unity and enlightenment. Join me, Gwilda Wiyaka, and the Science of Magic right here on the Mutual Broadcast Network. For more information, visit www.thescienceofmagic.net.
Gibbs A. Williams, Ph.D., is a practicing psychoanalyst, supervisor, researcher, and author in New York City. Much of his life has been dedicated to understanding nature and the uses of meaningful coincidences or synchronicities. His radical and original non-Jungian, non-mystical, non-magical theory of synchronicities illuminates much of the fog surrounding this challenging and perplexing topic. His ideas and manners are fresh, presented in a style that is both entertaining and highly informative. He is also an expert on crisis intervention, specially focused on violence reduction for the police and citizens, mastering anxiety, frustration, and stress without the use of medication, and effectively preventing and treating heroin addiction. Dr. Williams can be contacted at his email address at gwwilliamsny11@aol.com or visit his website at Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to the X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell, The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, X-1, Dimension X, Space Patrol, and every minute of the X-Zone Broadcast Network by calling 213-401-0080, courtesy of Audio Now. No smartphone, app, or internet needed. It saves your data plan and it's free if you have unlimited minutes. Call 213-401-0080 to listen on any phone, anytime, anywhere. Remember 213-401-0080 for the best of the paranormal, parapsychology, and sci-fi radio programming anywhere, 24/7, 365.
True healing must address 4 levels: physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual, for us to live joyful and productive lives. We tend to treat 3 of the 4, leaving the spiritual languishing. If you're tired of the same dysfunctional patterns cropping up in your life, Soul Balancing is for you. Trixie Phelps, owner and founder of Soul Balancing, is a naturally gifted energy healer trained in numerous esoteric forms, including shamanism. Trixie has created a powerful modality that safely and effectively clears your energetic field. A soul balancing session can remove interference, heal trauma, and restore your hope. Contact Trixie for a life-changing long-distance session today, www.soulbalancing.world.
We have returned with Don Ledger, who is talking about the ShagHarbour UFO crash, which is detailed in the book Dark Object, the world's only government documented UFO crash. And we say government documented, from what Don has told us and from what his research has shown, is that the government, the Canadian government, was involved from the very beginning with this, from the law enforcement aspect of it to the military aspect of it. And I know that there was a great deal of documentation generated about this case. And I think we'll just cut right to the chase here, because I know you want to talk about the maritime UFO cases as well. But when we're talking about the documentation, did they draw any conclusions about what had happened?
Yeah, eventually they didn't draw a solid conclusion as to what it was. They drew a solid conclusion as to what it wasn't, which was a crashed aircraft and anything else that they could determine. It was a bit of a conundrum for them, let's face it, and they had a lot of equipment was involved, a lot of manpower was involved here, so it wasn't a fly-by-night thing. This went on basically for 4 or 5 days, right, at least until Sunday night, and till the divers finally packed in and they went back to Stadacona in Halifax, and the Mounties they did write a report on it, and of course there are reports in those documents you'll see from you're going to actually see the telexes going back and forth between Maritime Command in Halifax and Can Marcom they call it, and Ottawa, and about divers, about the situation. One of the documents by Squadron Lead William Bain at the air desk in Ottawa had remarked on what had happened down there, and he called it the Dark Object. That's where we got the title from for the book, and because they had no other name for it. But he also used UFO in the margins with three lines underlining that himself, and his name was on the top, and so they were taking this considerably seriously. As you know, they were a little bit, a little less objectionable about these things, Kevin, back in the day, as opposed to what happens nowadays. And so it was being taken very seriously, considering the document trail on this thing, at least from the fact that something was going on in ShagHarbour, but as to what it was, nobody knows. Now, if you got a moment there were a couple of small incidents here that came to light after the book. And one towards the end of it was before Laurie Wickens and his crew showed up to pull in, a guy who was a switch tender, which for the railroad, was returning, going down towards Lower Woods Harbor, and he pulled over on the side of the road, right just past the Irish Moss Plant, maybe a couple of 100 feet, and to look up at the sky because he saw 2 moons up there. And that confused him. So he got out of the car to look at them. One of the moons separated and went down towards and landed on the water right beside the Irish Moss Plant. He's in his car and took off. Now, this was reported to us by his daughter, who said that the reason he never ever brought it up was the fact that he was going to Lower Woods Harbor to visit his girlfriend, and he was married. And so he didn't want anybody to know about that. And he told his daughter about it on his deathbed. He was dying of brain cancer.
Oh,
and
for
then,
crying out loud, now, the UFOs move into the realm of midnight assignations.
Yeah, well, there's 2 of them, all right? Here's another one for you. Before Laurie and them got there, and they didn't realize it when they hauled onto the parking lot, there was another car there already, but it was on the other side of the Irish Moss Plant between the edge of the building and an embankment. And there was a young fella and his girlfriend in there, and probably up to no good, and they watched the thing land on the water very gently. But how we found out about that, and maybe 200 other people that were in the auditorium at the time, is I'd gotten a call from a friend of mine who was one of the nephew of one of the guys who went out in the first boats that night, and he told me that he had a fisherman down there who told him this story. But he said, I don't want to give any names, he said, because I don't want to embarrass the young lady I was with. This was probably about six or 7 years ago. And he said, so I was telling everybody this at one of our ShagHarbour conferences down in ShagHarbour at the elementary school, and I started telling this story. And I got to the point about the woman being with the guy, and then this woman pops up in the audience and said, well, that was me. And she said, that's why I'm here. I want to hear more about the story. She didn't have any problems about being embarrassed by it at all. I mean, there was 200 more other people out in that auditorium.
But what,
And
what is
so,
what is a UFO sighting without a little bit of sex involved? I
yeah,
mean,
well, you got to.
we got to move in those arenas.
The place is actually named, ShagHarbour is named after a fish that's called a shag. But you know the British interpretation of shag.
I wasn't going to go there. I was going to
Yeah.
avoid that if possible.
Well, Mike Myers made a big movie, using the title "The Spy That Shagged Me," and but apparently, they had good reason for naming it, a double meaning anyway, without getting into that. So it didn't bring that to a halt because, as you know, if you read the book, there's a second component to this thing off of Shelburne, which is supposedly where these things came back to light again at the same time. And
let me ask you this.
Sure.
There were reports that the U.S. Navy was involved in some fashion. Was there a Navy vessel involved at all in this, the search?
Some of the fishermen down there said that they saw they thought was a U.S. Navy submarine just off the mouth of Cape Saint, or right off the mouth of the Sound or Bon Portage, and it just sat there. And they'd have permission to enter our waters because we did that quite often between Canada and the United States. That still do. And aircraft, crossing sovereignty lines, borders and so on, usually by permission. And but anyway, so they thought they saw one out there that night. There was reports of a submarine, and off of Shelburne as well. But there's 5 or 6 other ships apparently camped over 2 objects sitting on the bottom off the mouth of Shelburne Harbor.
Now, other ships. Are you talking Canadian military vessels?
Mostly Canadian, and there was a possibility of some American destroyers there, an American destroyer as well. Now, the reason we get that is, and I can mention his name, is Leo Gannot. He was one of a diver from the Fleet Diving Unit. And Chris had asked a friend of his, who was the son of the Fleet Diving Unit trainer, scuba trainer for the Navy, if he could track down the names of the divers for the ShagHarbour incident. Well, he's tracked down the names of some divers, but unfortunately, not necessarily unfortunately, what it turned out was they were the divers involved off of Shelburne, not in ShagHarbour. And one of them was Leo Gannot. And he was he had a lot of bravado. And when Chris first contacted him, he said told him the story of what had happened. And then subsequent to that, both him and myself ran across people who verified that the same thing had happened off of Shelburne, and that there was 2 objects supposedly had come up from ShagHarbour underwater and camped off the mouth of Shelburne Harbor, and in front of the government point, which was the entrance point for SUSIS, which is the American underwater surveillance, microphone underwater surveillance system.
Now, when you say 2 objects, are you suggesting that there was 2 objects underwater and they moved underwater away from the ShagHarbour area?
Yeah, and one about 23 nautical miles up the coast and right off the mouth of Shelburne Harbor, where there's an island there called McNutt's Island, and there's a lighthouse there. And
what happened to them? What happened to these objects? Now, these are the objects from ShagHarbour. They've now moved 22 nautical miles away. What happened to them? Where did they go?
Okay. Can't swear to those are the same 2 objects, but this is the inference we're getting. We're getting this from military people now, and absolutely no documentation, but all anecdotal. So that's what makes it difficult. But, I mean, they swear to it. I mean, electronic intelligence, submarine warfare aircraft that were tracking the things. They're the ones that gave us the detail on where the things initially came from. Well, from Siberia over northern Canada, NORAD scrambled aircraft out of Goose Bay and North Bay in Ontario, Goose Bay in Labrador, to try to intercept, and then the thing all of a sudden stopped. It was doing about 7,700 miles an hour, one of them anyway. We don't know where the second one came from. It might have been already there for all we know. But anyway, this thing came down, it stopped, and that's when they called back on the scramble, because they were scrambling F-104s up into the Canadian North. I mean, they weren't coming back. They didn't have the range.
Let me stop you here, because I'm getting a little confused. Are you suggesting that the object that fell into ShagHarbour was tracked from Siberia across Canada, and there were multiple attempts to intercept it? Is that what you're saying here?
Yeah, they were going to try to intercept it. They launched, and then they recalled when this thing stopped and hovered for about 4 minutes, and then it continued on at about 4,400 miles an hour, came down over eastern Canada, over the edge of Labrador, between Labrador and Quebec, down over the Nova Scotia part of New Brunswick, and there's all kinds of evidence to support that by UFO sightings that happened. And like I said, Kevin, it's so convoluted. There's so many different sightings. The Mountie and the other, again,
were these intercepts? Is this documented? Do you have documents that's about these intercepts?
No, that's the point. We just have anecdotal evidence. And but I mean, we know the people. I've got one of the guys' names written down here that I'm going to see sometime in the next couple of weeks, because I might do a small story up around that itself. He was an electronic intelligence officer on an Argus, which was a four-engined anti-submarine warfare aircraft with the Stinger on the back and everything. You know, drop sonar buoys, could drop bombs, the whole 9 yards if it had to. But he was on one of these, and that's what they were doing, was tracking. He said, which was odd, because we were allowed to fly right down over the Gulf of Maine, down into the United States and back up again. In the meantime, they had their own aircraft doing the same thing. There were some Neptunes involved, Neptune aircraft. You probably know what I'm talking about. And but this thing was a big 4-engine thing. It could it could cross the Atlantic in the middle, for God's sakes, and stay aloft for 23 hours. But anyway, it flew out of Greenwood, Nova Scotia. There's a big Air Force base there too. But I mean, there's so much detail. It's hard to explain it in the short time we have, Kevin.
Yeah, and, you've thrown in an awful lot of information here.
Yeah,
and I'm trying to keep it straight in my mind, and I'm familiar with the case.
Yeah, I know.
So
we're
talking about an object that came from the west, Siberia.
North, over Siberia, but curved around quickly over to the north and over Ellesmere Island, and
crossing Canada. It stops and hovers for 4 minutes. It continues on, and then it drops into ShagHarbour.
Yeah, it comes down and crosses over various spots. The Bay of Fundy, curves inwards over the area called Digby Neck, over Wedgeport, and fishing boats down there that thought there was now this is where we get to the point where there seems to be two objects. And I even had the radio operator who was handling the radio messages that night for the Navy say, as soon as I called him, he said, yeah, there was two objects that night. And I said, well, I didn't know that for sure, but I suspected, because I had the other two people that attested to that, and some other people. And so these things came across where I was saying from Maitland, another Mountie involved, and 3 game wardens who were staked on at another site on the other side of Nova Scotia looking for deer jackers. And the next day when they did a track of the thing they saw crossing over, they found one of them, the Bert Green, his name was, who was a game warden, said to the Mountie, he said, this thing went over, looks like it went over towards ShagHarbour. And he said, well, that's what I came over to tell you. They had a big incident over in ShagHarbour. 3 of our Mounties were out there. They saw it. And,
well, let me break in here, because I'm getting right up against the break time again.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And we've just, I mean, this has exploded way beyond where I thought it was going to go. So let me say this. You can get more information at www.donledger.com/uap.html. And I always put up information on my blog at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. And I've covered the case in a couple of books. The Randle Report and the Scientific Ufology talks about this case to give you more information. We'll return in just a moment with Don Ledger and see if we can't bring this to some kind of a conclusion, so we all understand what happened. We will be right back.
This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to the X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell, The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, X-1, Dimension X, Space Patrol, and every minute of the X-Zone Broadcast Network by calling 213-401-0080, courtesy of Audio Now. No smartphone, app, or internet needed. It saves your data plan and it's free if you have unlimited minutes. Call 213-401-0080 to listen on any phone, anytime, anywhere. Remember 213-401-0080 for the best of the paranormal, parapsychology, and sci-fi radio programming anywhere, 24/7, 365.
I am Dr. Carl O'Helvey, founder, president of a new cancer foundation focusing on evidence-based physical, mental, and spiritual interventions, including natural cancer cures, prayer, meditation, affirmations, nutrition, and other related holistic cancer prevention and cure modalities. These are used in cancer education, research, and financing care. I ask for your help to continue this important work by donating at www.holisticcancerfoundation.com.
Wouldn't you love to know the secret to everything? I'm Dr. Kimberly McGeorge, and on The Secret to Everything, we will merge the practical with open investigation into all realms of the mysterious. We will talk to cutting-edge alternative health practitioners, those who inspire and motivate you in business and life, and of course, we will share stories of the paranormal, conspiracy, and cryptozoology. You will transform because of the frequency I carry, the frequencies my guests carry. Life may never be the same after you listen to this program, for the secret to everything is for you, the listener, for those who desire more in every area of their lives and believe that it can still be found. Listen and discover thesecrettoeverything.com.
Little children aren't the only ones afraid of the dark. Millions of soldiers return from war zones with PTSD, anger, frustration, fear, and loneliness, much of which surfaces during the darkness of the night. You have the chance to change the lives of these American heroes. Songs and Stories for Soldiers.us provides free MP3 players for these men and women. With a list of 3 million songs in 16 different styles, 100,000 audiobooks, and 30,000 old-time radio programs, every veteran can find something to soothe and comfort them at no cost. All our players contain an 8-hour audio program designed to help veterans fall asleep. With 1,500 plus vets now participating, it's our goal to deliver 10,000 audio players this year. Go to our website at songsandstoriesforsoldiers.us. Help us help a veteran make it through the night.
You're listening to the X Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net.
And we have returned with Don Ledger, who has complicated the ShagHarbour case beyond all comprehension at this point. I think we've recapped it a couple of times here, and I'll make sure I've got this stuff right, that prior to the object falling into ShagHarbour, there is anecdotal evidence based on eyewitness testimony of an object coming into Canada from the west, crossing over Canada, hovering briefly, was joined by a second object apparently, and one of them then fell into ShagHarbour. Is that essentially what we're talking about here?
Well, it seems to be that. I wouldn't fell. I'd say it landed gently on the water. Now, maybe it had to go underwater. I don't know, Kevin. Who knows? You know. It anyway. It disappeared underwater, and the next thing you know, at the same time over in apparently at the same time over in off Shelburne, about not long afterwards, we got a big incident going on over there underwater. But that wasn't known about for probably 25 or 30 years. And
so where we are here is we've got this wonderful sighting in ShagHarbour from October of 1967, and I wanted to get in here briefly and mention that during the UFO investigation by the United States at that time, the Condon Committee, they actually made a phone call to ShagHarbour to talk about the case, and were unable to gather much information, didn't gather much information about it, and wrote it off as some kind of a hoax and didn't bother investigating it. But that's correct. And so it was not really a big part of the U.S. Government investigation of UFOs. But as you and Chris Stiles were doing your research, you uncovered documents, official documents that talked about this UFO sighting at ShagHarbour. Is that correct?
Right, yeah. Chris found them first. When he first started getting involved in this, he dragged me into this thing about a year later. We both joined MUFON, and we had a meeting together, and we were talking about how we would proceed in Nova Scotia investigating UFOs. And he said, well, I'm looking into this one that happened back in 1967, and as it turned out, I was actually right there that night. And I was a traveling salesman. I used to travel at night to get there for the next morning, and I was past the area probably about 2 hours or 3 hours after the incident. So anyway, and then it was in the papers when I got home. My wife brought it up to me. He said, did you see that thing in the paper? I said, no. Anyway, this whole thing just sort of blew up later on. As when you write a book, Kevin, you know, later on you're going to get people that are going to come out of the woodwork and say, hey, listen, I got some information for you, which is basically what sort of happened with ShagHarbour. And although we did have the story about what happened off of Shelburne at the same time, and then 2 divers going down on this thing, and for a few days they camped over for 7 days apparently, these 2 objects, and they were down taking pictures. Now, if they were taking pictures underwater of anything in the waters off of Nova Scotia, they were probably within 10 or 15 feet of it, because the water is very cloudy. It's loaded with plankton. I know, I'm a scuba, or was a scuba diver myself for years, and they did apparently photograph it there, and that's probably where you heard about the photographic thing. But we were never able to contact the fellow who now lives apparently in Cornwallis, Ontario, but he would never talk to us about it. So they don't want to talk about it. A lot of these guys were scared of their pensions, Kevin, including Leo Gannot. I didn't bring his name up or mention his real name, the diver, until he died a couple of years ago. So then, we didn't have to worry about his pension anymore. But, their pensions were threatened. They were warned away. I've had numerous instances of this where people were warned by the military not to talk about stuff. Well,
they were warned not to talk about this case specifically, though, also, right?
Yeah, this particular one, in particular, that's what these 2 guys or this guy and the electronic intelligence officer, who was going to be on the sightings program remember that program that was on in the States there back in the 90s?
Yes.
Chris actually got them to come up here, and they spent about $35,000 diving around down in the Sound, and that's when. And Chris had contacted this fellow to show up, the RCAF officer who left the forces, the service in '72, and he said sure, and they were supposed to do it on a Saturday, and so anyway, he calls Chris and asks him if he could meet him at a Tim Hortons, that's like Dunkin' Donuts, or the other one, and so Chris met him, and the guy shows up at 9 o'clock at night. It's dark. It's also October. And he's got dark sunglasses on a baseball cap. And he said, listen, I just wanted to tell you I can't do that show tomorrow, or that thing tomorrow. And Chris said, oh, that's too bad. And so he said, yeah, I'm sorry. He said, I'll have to bail on that one or whatever. And Chris said, well, okay, I guess we'll have to do, we got some other witnesses maybe we can work with there. And so they broke up. So I called up this guy again, and because he's still alive and he lives probably within 400 or 500 yards of me here, and right now. And he said, yeah, that's what happened. And I said, you know what? Chris never asked you why you didn't want to do it. And he said, I was told not to. And I said, by whom? He said, I was eating my supper. It was around 6 o'clock on Friday night. I was supposed to meet Chris the next day. And this voice comes on and said, I'm a ranking officer at DND in Ottawa, Department of National Defense. And he said, you're supposed to be doing an interview on this ShagHarbour thing, and I'm ordering you not to. And he said,
ordering him not to.
Yeah, tell him not to do it. And he said, you signed an affidavit in 1972, a secrecy affidavit. That probably had more to do with electronic intelligence. But anyway, and he said, well, okay. He said, and he wasn't really caring about his pension because he was a major contractor by this time and doing very well without this minuscule pension he would have got from carried on from 1972. And so he said, well, all right. So I said, well, what do you know about that? So I learned that. I'm sorry, Kevin. A few years later, I get a phone call from a friend of mine who's a civil engineer who used to be in the Army. He's got a retired Army major who says he wants to meet with me because something weird happened to him. We can't even get into that now, Kevin. We don't have the time. But essentially, what happened was we saw a monster UFO when he was returning back from a training exercise with his driver in broad daylight, 2:00 in the afternoon, missing time, the whole 9 yards. Now this guy is, a wounded warrior soldier. He was in Laos during the Vietnam War, running interdiction for the Americans, and our special forces group up here had been wounded there, grenade, and so anyway. He tells me about that, and then we get talking about different things. I said, I had a lot of trouble with the military. I said, well, I was trying to get some witnesses to talk, and he said, what do you mean? I said, well, one of my witnesses, the story I just told you about the guy getting the phone call. And he says, oh yeah, I've done that. And I said, you called up people and told them not to talk about a UFO incident? He said, no, not about that. It'd be some other stuff. He said, but, if we wanted to, we didn't want somebody to talk about it to the media or something, we call them up, tell them we're a ranking officer from Ottawa, and we don't want you to talk about this. And probably with veiled threats about their pension or whatever. And so, geez, I was flabbergasted when I heard that. I'm sitting right across from a guy that's, who's a retired, just recently retired major from the Canadian Armed Forces, and he's telling me this, outright. But anyway, tons of stuff surrounding this particular case and other cases, Kevin. Sometimes they all tie together, And it's,
when you put some of this you couldn't have put in Dark Object because it came out after you wrote the book. But is some
exactly,
of this, yeah. Is some of this is a lot of this is covered. The documentation is covered in the book Dark Object, correct?
Yeah, not too much. They only put about 2 leaves in there with about 4 pages of the documents, and they're minuscule to start with. There's probably about 40 of them. And mostly just the telexes and everything going back and forth about bringing assets to ShagHarbour, what it was, and they're called a CFAO 71-6 action order. The CFAO, Canadian Forces Action Order, which is which they put down detail on there, and you'd say, well, this stuff doesn't seem to be connected, but you'll see A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. On the left-hand side of it, and if you go to the code for A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, you'll see witness, time, date of occurrence, weather, blah, 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 going down, and what the question is without actually looking at it, on these documents. But they're pretty well illuminated anyway. I mean, they usually have an explanatory note on the bottom or whatever.
Well, to kind of wrap this up, and I know we didn't get to the maritime UFOs that we wanted to do, so we'll have to do that again at another time and specifically talk about that. But to wrap this up, we know there's documentation. The government said they didn't know what it was, but couldn't identify what it was, but they knew what it wasn't. And all of this came out from government files, so that's well documented in that respect.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that part of it, the ShagHarbour incident, is pretty well documented as to what they were up to and what they were doing, what they did find, what they didn't find. There's 23 seconds of film that CBC shot of the fishing boats out crisscrossing, and the Coast Guard cutter crisscrossing the waters off ShagHarbour looking for the stuff on the bottom.
And they attempted to collect some of the foam, but were unable to do that, so we don't have any kind of analysis of that.
It's even referred to in one of the documents. It's too bad they weren't able to grab a sample. They tried to, but it just wouldn't pick up. Nobody had a bucket or something. They should have thrown a bucket over the side, I guess. But
yeah, it sounds like there was enough they could have done that.
Well, they probably could have, Kevin. But I mean, people are at the time looking for bodies. They're not thinking about a UFO or anything like that. But it's just they're misdirected in their heads as to what was really going on. Just to mention, too, I'm doing one of these conferences. This one's in Toronto, at the Toronto International, Pearson International, June 23rd to 25th. It's called the Alien Cosmic Expo. And it's a UFO conference, one of the first I've done in the last couple of years now.
Well, Don, we're
Yep.
out of time. We're just flat
Yeah.
out of time. You got that mentioned. You're going to be speaking at that conference here coming up in June. So if people want to know more and talk to you about it, that's where they can see you. Your website is www.donledger.com/uap.html. And your book is Dark Object, the world's only government documented UFO case. And your other book is Maritime UFOs. Your other book is Maritime UFOs. We will be back next week with Paul Kimball talking about UFOs and Oak Island for that matter. And if you want more information, take a look at www.kevinrandle.com. Thank you for tuning in.